Hey guys, how are y'all? Sorry, there was a little bit of, I was teaching, but it didn't have me as the host, so I had to get Liz to fix it. So I apologize for anybody that is waiting or waited longer than they needed to. Looks like we've got a couple people on. Any questions before we get started? I'm sharing obviously, and I'm gonna put my email in the chat. So if y'all have any questions about the documents that we're going over, then I can send you the document numbers, or if you have any additional questions about anything South Carolina after this, then you can let me know. Let me see. I'll put and it's just Sharon.Martin@KW. So that's my email. If you have any questions, or if you want me to send you an email with the documents that we went over with all their numbers, I'll be glad to do that. I'll wait a couple minutes. I tried to log on about 5 minutes early, but it wouldn't let me. So again, I apologize for the delay. I just kind of signed up to, Lynn reached out yesterday, so I don't think they had me in as a host. Anybody want to tell me where they're at in their career? If they're licensed South Carolina, just got new licensed South Carolina, have any challenges with South Carolina listings, getting ready to do a listing? Anybody got anything good before we start? No. Looks like we're going to be the quiet ones, so all good. So I will not keep you. It says we are from 1 to 3. If we have questions, definitely you can stop me during. It doesn't look like there's a lot of people on, but if you don't have any questions, then I'll be glad to go over anything afterward as far as question wise. So let me just get this view right. Sorry. All right, much better. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so we are focusing on South Carolina listing today, and I want to make sure that's what everybody signed up for. So we are going to review the forms that if you were contacted to do a listing in South Carolina, this is what you would need. There actually is a very good checklist in South Carolina documents, and that checklist is called Form 240. I'm not going to go over it directly because you probably don't have a copy of it, but it's a great checklist before you go to a listing to actually look at what information you have and what information you need to get from them. I've always used this. A lot of people, when I talk about it, don't even know that it is in there. It kind of makes sure you've got their right names. What mortgage do they have? Do they have a termite bond? Did you get a key? Do they have a copy of a survey? Any deed restrictions, the furnaces that would stay, refrigerator, washer and dryer, those things, their utility company. So, we have these lists in North Carolina that Keller Williams has obviously made, or we've made as agents, but this one actually is a Form 240, and it's just called a listing checklist, and it is by the state of South Carolina realtors. So, attorneys put this together. So it's a great checklist that when you're prepping for a listing, you want to use it to make sure you have everything. And then actually I use it a good bit while I'm sitting with a seller to get the right information. So don't forget about this Form 240. It is a great checklist. Obviously, if we are taking a listing, we know that we need a working with real estate agents for South Carolina brochure. It's a little bit different than the one in North Carolina that just got redone last year, but that's pretty easy. I won't go over that. You've been through that enough in class. The other things that you will need, and I won't go over those directly, but you will need the property disclosures. And remember, in South Carolina, there's 2 property disclosures for every property. So you have form, let me see what form number it is. that tells me. It's the South Carolina Real Estate Property Disclosure Statement. It's 5 pages. It's very similar to the North Carolina one. You know, they have 3 choices: yes, no, no representation, but there are a couple things that is different. So you're gonna need a copy of this when you actually either send it to them before you go to the listing or send it to them while you're at the listing. You know, my common practice is I like to send it to them before so they can work on it like their homework. They can have it filled out. We, of course, as agents are not supposed to fill this out. We can help them with questions, but I like to get this at the time of the listing, because technically if we're putting in a listing on MLS, we need to have these loaded. And I'll tell you, the worst mistake you can make is to actually leave the house and say, send me this later, because you'll be tracking them down to get it. So this is very common to the North Carolina disclosure if you got licensed in North Carolina first. In addition, they have a South Carolina residential property disclosure statement addendum. I usually get the question, does this need to be done if it's a single family detached home? Because a lot of this is HOA information, more condo, townhouse, but South Carolina does require that both of these be filled out by the seller and put into MLS. So you still have 2 forms as property disclosures, just like North Carolina. The only difference is South Carolina does not have a mineral and oil gas like we do in North Carolina. So you're going to need both of these forms completed by the seller. And if anybody has questions about these, we can go through them. But our purpose today is just to go through the actual South Carolina listing agreement. So if you don't have a copy, want to pull a copy, we are looking at the executive exclusive right to sell agreement listing agreement. It is 5 pages. It is Form 220. I'll give you a little history. I started real estate in South Carolina and then moved to North Carolina. And I think this listing agreement is a little bit easier than the North Carolina one. It's less paperwork, so not as difficult to explain to a seller. So we'll go through that. Any questions so far? And you feel free, there's not many on, so you can stop me if there's questions. So I'm just going to go through line by line. I'm going to treat you like you've never written this document. Basically, page 1 is information. You are going to put the actual name of your seller. So let's use John Smith in the first line. That's the sole property owners. And remember, South Carolina is 1 to sell and buy, where North Carolina is 2. So in South Carolina, if you are visiting a client and you are listing their house, and John Smith bought this house before he got married, and Jane Smith is not on the deed, she's not on the loan, she necessarily does not have to be on this document unless she's been added. So we're going to focus on it totally being John Smith. He actually would be just his name, then Keller Williams Ballantyne, of course, like we do on every other contractor listing. We also do from the time period on, and this is your basically your listing time period. Whether you do 6 months, whether you do a year, I don't think anybody in this market's doing a year. But typically you're going to have a 6-month time period in here. So if it was today and you wanted to put 3/17/2022, then you would also figure that out to say 6 months from now on midnight. Today's market, I'll give you a little secret. Expirations date don't matter as much because we are not keeping things on the market 3 months, 6 months. I will tell you when the market becomes more balanced. and it's a little bit longer time period, you want to make sure that last date is conducive to you and the seller. You know, you don't want to put it expires on a Sunday night at 12 o'clock. You don't want to put it expires on Labor Day weekend. So make sure you're doing a little bit of homework before to make sure that you are aware of what that expiration date looks like. Just in case the listing wasn't selling, you wanted to get it extended, you know, you want to make sure you're doing things on a business time frame so you and the seller aren't scrambling to extend that date. The next part is about basically the information of the property, the lot, the block, the subdivision, the address, the tax map number, the parcel ID, obviously what county, the state, and you know, before you're going to the listing, you're going to prep with tax records. You're going to ask the seller a couple of questions. So typically you would want to have this part already filled out when you got to the listing, and you want to make sure this information is correct with the actual tax records in lieu of looking at a previous listing. What I would normally do is print that previous listing. I would actually print a copy of the tax records. I would fill this in to my knowledge, and I would make sure that you verify with the seller that the lot number is correct, the subdivision is correct, things of that nature. Sorry, one second. Liz is asking me if I got in. So this top information is going to be things that you already have filled out before you send it to a seller to sign DocuSign, or before you actually meet with the seller, because it's going to make you look more professional. And then you just want to have them verified. Did I get the right subdivision? Did I get the right zip code? Things of that nature, the right county. I'll tell you a little secret as well. You actually need to put the address of the mailing address. And I know that sounds weird, but realistically, we have a lot of people used to, you know, Fort Mill gets a better connotation than like Lancaster. So, you know, Fort Mill is highly desired. Taxes are higher in York County versus Lancaster, things of that nature. So you want to make sure that you are using the right address. We've had people in our industry that say, yes, I'm in Lancaster, but I'm right at the border of Fort Mill. I want to put Fort Mill. By law, you should be putting the mailing address. If that mail goes to a Lancaster address, you need to put Fort Mill, even though you may consider that area Fort Mill. So just make sure you are doing the mailing address, and making sure that the tax records make that address the same. The next section describes actually the property that would stay with the home. And this is a big difference between North Carolina and South Carolina listing, because North Carolina so easily spells it out for us what would stay, you know, an oven, curtain rods, TV brackets. This is where you really want to sit with the seller, spend some time on this. What will stay, what won't stay. You know, a lot of times, because we're so close to that border, you get North Carolina agents thinking that TV bracket will automatically stay. Well, in this market in South Carolina, the way I was taught is if you wanted it to stay, you need to write it in there. So this is where, if they were planning on leaving the washer, the dryer, the refrigerator, you would make sure that they would put that in there so that there was no question when the property sold what was actually going to stay. Any questions about that part? I'll just keep going until somebody asks me. Your next section is just your agency documents. So obviously you are going to already have the conversation with the seller about agency. You have shown them the agency brochure. You have described to them the different types of agency. So this is when you may want to give them a refresher, and you may want to walk them through each one of these, and they can choose what they would like. The most common one is going to be the first one that acknowledges receiving an explanation of the agency agreement. and that they want to work with you exclusively in this. So that's going to be your most common choice. The next one, it actually gives you permission to act as a dual agent, will not be considered. So if they never want you to represent a buyer, then and only wants exclusive representation, they would need to initial that. The next one talks about dual agency might be considered, and in that you would do a dual agency agreement separately if that came up in the situation when you had the property listed. Permission to act as a designated agent will not be considered. Permission to act as a designated agent may be considered. And I will caution you, designated is great because if it's another Keller Williams from Charlotte and you are actually in Fort Mill, then because we still work under the same umbrella, we would need to get that disclosure signed. So you just want to make sure you are on top of your agency, know what it means, and know how to answer questions if sellers have questions. They, again, have the right to choose whatever selection they would want. They can choose 2 selections if they wanted, but you want to make sure you're on top of your game, understanding your agency when they ask you. So they would initial in that. So as we talked about, if we're setting ourselves up for success, looking like a professional, we show up to the listing, the top part may be filled out. This part is not filled out because you want to give them the option to choose and talk about the type of relationship that you are going to have. Now, if it's a repeat client, you know what they want, what they'll allow, you've done business, you have a warm, friendly relationship, you may go ahead and fill these in because you may know what y'all have done in the past and you just may want to review it and say, yes, is that the same type of agency? Section 2, this is when you're going to set that price. You're going to make sure that you have the service fee, the commission fee. So a lot of this can be filled in or maybe not filled in if you are having the conversation to the side on what the listing agreement would be. So this is very simple. You know, if it's 350,000, then I'm going to write 3THRE, write it out, 350,000. I'm also going to put 350,000 here. I'm going to put my total commission amount, whether that's 6%, 5%, whatever, in this bracket. So typically when you are actually going to a listing consultation, you're sitting down with that seller, you probably don't have that filled out unless you have already been talking on a conference call and you know exactly what y'all have agreed on these terms. This is very important that you get these terms right because this essentially will be what compliance is looking for in command when you're putting in the MLS. The next part, at the bottom of the page, it says, if the property is sold within X days of expiration or termination of this agreement, I'm not going to read the legalese here. I'm just going to explain what this means. I usually will put 180 days. There's no rhyme or reason. Some people put 90 days. Some people put 180. Some people put 30 days. In our MLS, when we research back items, it normally is typically 180 days. So I think that's where that comes from. And this market might be 90 days. What that means is if you were the procuring calls today, you brought the buyer, your marketing brought the buyer showed on your watch, and then they canceled the listing on Friday, and that buyer wanted to come back and make an offer, that you would still be the procuring calls because it's within that time frame. Don't get into a lot of this time in this heated market because people aren't changing agents a lot, but this is more like if somebody decided to end an agency agreement with you, you were the procuring calls of the buyer, the new agent listing picked it up tomorrow, that same buyer came back, you essentially were the procuring calls and could be entitled to a service fee or commission. I'm not going to get into a lot of that, but normally I put 180 days in this. Questions about any of that? I'll move on real quickly. Part 2, page 2, actually talks about the compensation to other brokers. So I'm in section 3, and I'm really just going through the form, filling out what needs to be filled out. That is where you are going to have the conversation with the seller, or you run your business the way you run it, to say, if I take 6%, I'm going to pay the buyer's agent 3% to bring us a buyer. So again, in South Carolina, I really don't do any denominations other than the price of the home, but I would put in your 3% there. There are times that it might be a non-agent, which is a transactional broker, which South Carolina has a lot in their systems. So either way, you would pay them 3%. It wouldn't be like 3 plus 3. So that, again, is going to be the conversation that you run your business the way you do, but that would essentially be coming out of your commission. So you're going to fill in your percentage there. You're going to go through the earnest money piece. You're going to make sure that a seller understands earnest money, that we as Keller Williams don't hold it. It'll be a mutual party. It could be the buyer's agent's affiliation or firm. Most likely in today's world, it is a closing attorney. You want to make sure that you have the conversations with sellers that, you know, the earnest money is given, but not always going to be received. So many times agents will tell the seller, well, you're going to keep the earnest money. We don't know if they're going to keep it or not. We know historically, traditionally, if buyers walk away, the seller would keep it. But remember, there's all those termination forms, release forms that have to be mutually signed to receive the earnest money. So I'm not sure that you want to tell them automatically they receive the earnest money. You want to go over it with them and tell them 9 times out of 10 they will. But if we got to that point, it would depend on the situation. You know, the state of South Carolina has to have that form signed, saying both parties agree to give back the earnest money in order for it to be received back to a buyer. If the buyer doesn't sign that form, the seller doesn't automatically get it. It could sit at an attorney's office for 90 days and then go to the state if nobody agrees. So again, I'm not here to get into legal, but you definitely want to have those conversations up front so that if things go south in the transaction, you know, you have had that conversation. Is not a surprise to the seller. The next part really talks about brokers, signs, you know, the owner's duty. So I'll go through that. Obviously, number 5 just says that the owner grants the broker to have a sign, a for sale sign, an under contract sign if you wanted to, a pending sign. So you want to make sure the seller is giving you permission to put a sign in the yard. If it's a townhouse or a condo, a sign in the window. I can't think of why people would not want to put a sign, especially with today's market and doing drive-bys. You know, 9 out of 10 people have driven by the house before they even decide to go in. A lot of people search our third-party websites. So I can't think of a reason why a seller would not want to do a sign, but you will get in that conversation. So you have to have their permission. The broker's duty. I would say take some time, really read this before you go to a listing. We can role play it, but you want to make sure that the seller understands it is your duty to make the best effort to secure a contract of sales on the property. Everything is confidential. You know, we don't gain anything. Any information they tell us, we work for them exclusively, but if it's a material fact, we have to explain it. So you want to make sure that as a broker, we are not making any representation or guarantee to the sale of the property, but you do have systems in place. Keller Williams, you know, holds the listings. So you want to really read this to make sure you understand it in terms of being able to have a conversation with the seller. Most won't ask you anything specifically. You know, they'll ask how long is it going to take or what do you think it'll sell for? But you want to make sure you're on your toes and knows what this means if somebody actually asks you. And I'll say South Carolina listing agreement is pretty easy to read and understand versus other documents. So it will make sure that that you understand it so you can explain it. And really the thing here is to remind them that we have a level of integrity, that they can trust us, that information is private. We're not selling their information, things of that nature. Any questions about that part? That's really where you've probably already bonded with that relationship if they've selected you to do the listing, but you also want to remind them of those things. Brokers limitation. Owner agrees broker provided owner with the benefits, service, assistance, and the value of bringing about this contract in consideration and recognition of the risks, rewards, compensation, benefits. So here again, this is just saying, you know, we have given them information. We have given them the comps. We have actually asked permission to put a sign. We have showed them we work for Keller Williams, a reputable firm. We have actually agreed on a purchase price. So this again, it's just saying, we haven't told you list with me. I'll send you on a 5-day cruise if you list with me. We are going into this agreement because this is our job. We are professional. We have systems in place. But again, nobody can guarantee that the house will sell and you'll get the terms that you agreed on. Section 8 talks about the owner's duties. And I always tell any seller, if I'm going to give you 120%, I need 90 to 100% for you. I need to make sure that you give me information, reliable. Don't, if the roof's leaking, I need to know the roof's leaking. I need to make sure you keep the home in good standard condition. If people are looking at the home, make up your bed. If our listing is on the market right here at springtime and we're getting a lot of rain and grass is growing, then you're going to need to cut the grass every 2 weeks. But this basically informs the brokers of their duty. I'll tell you, a lot of people don't take time to go over this, but then they have trouble with the seller later. So this is very important that you get that buy-in from the seller, that they will give you everything they've got. If a porch has been built but not permitted, you need to know about it. They will allow showings. This is a perfect opportunity to have the conversation to say, it's going to be crazy the first 24, 48 hours. Go out of town, go rent a hotel, use the indoor pool. The first weekend is like the honeymoon phase. So if we've got 10 showings lined up, you can't cancel 5 of them because it is game time. So these are the great conversations to have with these people, that they must allow an inspection. Section C says to permit an inspection showing of the property. They have to let the buyer in. They don't have to let the buyer in 9 times after you go under contract, but the buyer has the right to have a home inspection. That you can't sell to anybody based on, their race or sex or color or anything, that all money is green and we don't care who buys the property as long as they're qualified by a lender and as long as they have the money. Section E, I'll talk about, it says to permit the broker to incur or pay on behalf of the owner's reasonable expenses for repairs, inspections, utilities, maintenance, and similar expenses not to exceed, there's a blank in there, for separate expenses, and reimburse the broker as necessary upon receipt of the statement or expenses. So I'll let you choose what you want to do for your business. I normally, based on the relationship, don't do any denomination. I have had sellers that I had a great working relationship with that we would put $100 or $200. Say, for instance, they were out of town and something happened and the water got cut off and I had to get the water turned back on. I normally will put the honest ownership on the seller and put 0, so that if anything needs to be done, taken care of, the sellers are paying for it, because I don't want to get into they owe me this, sending a receipt to closing. It becomes a sticky situation sometimes. So I usually will put 0. There are some great, tried, trusted, repeat clients that I have put a denomination in here. But my recommendation is if it's something that needs to be done, the seller's ownership would take care of it. And you wouldn't get into money at that part. Section H just talks about closing, that they need to be at closing. Section G talks about they agree to publish the listing. If it's in MLS, you'll have pictures. People will do drive-bys. They should not let anybody in unless they have an actual scheduled appointment. But all of this on page 2 at the bottom, owner's duties. Section A through M is really a good time to slow down, go over it with the seller, and really make sure they understand that it's a relationship and we're working hard. We need them to do a couple of things as well. I have found that if I take a longer time on this section, then there's not as many challenges later down the road with a seller saying what I do here or why I do here, or, you know, problems. So it might take you a little bit longer in the beginning to go through this listing agreement, but I would say that it's worth the time because it'll save you some time later. Section I talks about to convey a marketable title to the buyer. So if you start talking about title and liens against it, you know, if you get to 2 days before closing and there's a tax lien against the seller and the attorney won't close until it's, you know, paid or coming out of the proceeds, then you're not having that sticky conversation with the seller because you talked about this and you reminded him at the time of listing that a seller would have to present a free and clear title. I find in my experience, the sticky conversations we get in is really not the seller's fault. It's my fault for not prefacing the seller and saying this could happen. Because if you talk about it could happen and then it comes up, the seller reacts a lot better. That's just my experience. Section J gives the owner's attorney and settlement agent to furnish copies of the settlement statement. You know, there's a lot of attorneys that are lenders that won't even give the agent a copy of the settlement statement unless they have the actual owner's permission to give us one. I was just in one last week that the buyer, I represented the buyer's lender did not want to give me a copy of the settlement statement before closing for me to check it. So we had to get the buyer to give permission. So this allows you to have a copy of that so you can check all the numbers before closing. This also talks about termination, that upon, you know, to furnish broker with written instructions regarding the confidentiality of information upon termination or completion of this agreement, which was received during the course of this agreement. So, you know, this is a termination form. If they were going to terminate a listing agreement, we would have to have everything in writing and everything documented. Any questions about that section? I feel like a lot of people, as I said, leave this section out. I think a lot of agents get worked up about the commission, the service fee, or the price, and they get worked about what they're going to do, but they don't always take the time to tell the seller, here's what I'm given, here's what I need from you, here's what could happen. And you don't want to scare them. You don't want to make them think these things will come up, but it'll really save you some time if you go through that. Section 9 talks about the property disclosure. Those of you that are licensed in North Carolina are going to know it's the same conversation. The seller needs to fill out the property disclosures to the best of their ability. If they don't know, you know, obviously they would put no representation. If they know, they are entitled to check it's a known defect. If you know the microwave doesn't work, the home inspector is going to find it, so you might as well go ahead and disclose it. So this has a conversation about the property disclosure and how it should be filled out to the best of the owner's information. I'll give you another tip right now. If it's a rental property and that seller has not lived in that property, he obviously probably knows what works and don't, because if he's property managing it himself, he knows if a toilet leaks or knows if the microwave works. It would be upon our recommendation, if he has not lived in that property, even though he's property management, just put no representation, because he has not lived in there day out, day. He doesn't know if the microwave has a short in it. He doesn't know if the toilet runs. So that's just the extra tip for today. If they, section 10 is a disclosure that the owner authorizes the broker to disclose information about the property to brokers, agents, sub-agents. So such as disclosures shall be put out there. Owner hereby is authorized anybody having a lien against the property and the mortgage holder to disclose. So this is, again, the seller is giving us information to work on their behalf, to list the property disclosures, to talk about if there's an HOA fee going up that we're aware of, we have to disclose it. And he has given us the permission to disclose what he has told us within reason that needs to be disclosed. You know, he's not giving us permission to tell everybody buying that house that he's in the middle of divorce. This is more, you know, property information in agreement with the company policy. Taxes, you'll talk about taxes. You'll talk about how that works, depending on what time of the year, if the seller pays the taxes, if the buyer gives the seller a credit. But that will be at the end in a on the property disclosure. So you'll have a conversation about that, that the closing attorney will check with the South Carolina tax office and see if there's any liens, see if taxes are up to date. They'll get that in a title search, and they will either collect for them or they'll give a credit to the seller if it's earlier in the year. Any questions about taxes? I know that gets a little confusing. The next section talks about coastal tides and wetlands. Most of us don't have to deal with this. I'll tell you, I got my license in South Carolina in Charleston, and we had to deal with this a lot more. But most of us in this area don't have to deal with coastal. You may actually get into some zoning with Lake Wylie, some engineered armory, things of that nature. But for the most part, coastal tides and wetlands isn't really a issue around where we live in the areas we cover in South Carolina, but it is there for a reason. So then it becomes section 13 when you talk about the multiple listing marketing. And again, we talked about having this form ready to fill out the information in there we know, but this is the part that you would not want to fill out. You would want to make sure that you discuss with the seller here again. Most of the time it's going to be option 1, that they agree the property can be put into the MLS, they agree to have a sign, they agree to compensate a buyer's agent for bringing us a ready, willing buyer. They agree to have pictures, they agree for permits, they agree for, you know, title work to be done, things of that nature. So 9 times out of 10, option 1 is going to be what every seller and you discuss and you select. Option 2, it means that the seller does not consent for their property to be placed in the multiple listing service. Instead wishes to have the property listed as a broker exclusive. So that would be if we were just doing a firm exclusive and we only wanted to sell to maybe a Keller Williams agent within our office within a certain time period. And that's a whole nother conversation, but it is an option. But, you know, you would make sure that you had all the correct paperwork to submit for Keller Williams for compliance. Not a lot of that goes on. You know, if you're starting out in your career, you won't see a lot of that. You probably will maybe get into that later if you are developing in your career. But 9 times out of 10, the first option is going to be the best option for the seller. It goes to more people. The third parties pick it up. You're putting a sign in the yard, you're taking pictures, and they agree that it will be in MLS. That's also a good time to have the conversation with them that we can't control the third parties. So, you know, the Zillows, the realtor.coms, the things of that nature, we don't control them. Sometimes they feed off our stuff. Sometimes they get it right. Sometimes they don't. So that's a good time to bring that up when you're going over it with the listing. Lockbox. Section 14 just agrees that you are required to get permission from the seller to have a lockbox. It's as simple as that. So they're going to check a box. This would be something you could go ahead and select before you got with the seller, just because you know you're going to put a lockbox on the property. You want to make sure that you're putting it where the seller wants. You want to make sure you're going over security with that lockbox with the seller, so they understand, you know, that nobody can get in that lockbox unless they're a licensed agent. It also is a great time when I have a conversation with a seller to say, people will come into your house. I'm very lucky. I've never had anything taken, but we're not responsible. Let's don't give them ammunition. Let's don't leave $50 bills sitting on the bed. Let's put up prescription meds, things of that nature. Let's definitely don't leave guns out in a closet, you know, where children can get to them, anything. So again, going through situations when you're signing the listing agreement or talking to the seller is helping you get through the listing agreement and conversation. And it's also giving you points of a helpful, successful listing. So that one is pretty easy. It's self-explanatory. 15 is very often looked over, but it says, I am required to tell you every offer. So if we're listed at 350 and we get an offer at 300, don't yell at me because I sent it to you. I am required by law it is my responsibility to present every offer. I may not agree with the offer. You may not take the offer, but it is my responsibility that I have to present to you every offer. So that's a good to make a joke about the situation, but that way they won't yell at you, or they won't say, don't send me nothing below 349. Section 16, marketing the property after accepted offers. Brokers shall not continue marketing the property after an offer has been accepted unless requested in writing by the owner to do so. So typically we know what happens is you put the property under contract. You can put under contract to show, under contract not to show. You keep the sign in the yard. Hopefully you're getting signed calls. But realistically, the seller has to understand that per MLS rules, once we have an offer accepted meaning buyer sign, seller sign, executed, monies have been fulfilled, then we are still marketing the property maybe for a backup offer, but technically we can't accept another offer that the seller could go to. Again, not here today to get into legalese, but that's a good time to remind the seller, once we agree, it's executed or ratified, both parties have signed, we still market it as under contract, but we could take backup offers. If there's a due diligence period, we could let people know tomorrow's the last day of due diligence, is either moving forward or not. So that's a good conversation to have. No control of commission rates or fees. Now, you already got the commission locked down on the first page. You know, realistically, there's no standard commission. The broker's commission for services rendered in respect to any listing is solely a matter of negotiation between the broker and the owner, and it's not fixed, it's not controlled, it's not suggested, it's not recommended. You probably have already had this conversation before you get here. If you already know what you're charging them and they've agreed. So I wouldn't personally spend a lot of time on this unless maybe I was at a listing and there's having a conversation about so-and-so is doing it for this amount, and I needed to explain to them that there's no fixed or standard commission, and this is how I run my business, and this is what I bring to the table. So that's the reason why commission or service fees may differ, would be the best way to handle that conversation. Normally, you're not going to spend a lot of time on that because you've already locked down that commission rate before you get to this part of the listing agreement. Maintenance. Number 18 talks about that the owner agrees to maintain the property. Here again, including lawn, shrubs, grounds until the day of closing. I'll tell you, if you haven't done a lot of listings in the summertime, you get to that section where you're just had the grass cut this week, maybe Thursday, it rained Friday, Saturday. You go to close Monday or Tuesday, the grass is this high again, and the seller says, I just had the grass cut. So you want to, again, talk about it and say, you know what, if we're going to close the 12th, let's get the grass cut the 10th or 11th. Don't get it cut 2 weeks before. We want that property looking as show ready as it was curb appeal inside when we close, when the buyer does the walkthrough, minus your items. So again, good conversation piece here, that they agree to maintain the property. And that's everything. You know, if the dishwasher goes out and it's 2 days before closing, technically that dishwasher was working. The seller's responsibility is to have it corrected, give the buyer a credit. You know, just because they've had their inspection and repairs have been agreed on, we want to do what's right. You want to send the message to your seller that you do what's right ethically. So you want to make sure that they understand that. If they damage a wall when they're moving out of the house, then they got to get that wall fixed. So that's, again, all of these pinpoints, bullet points, numbers are great conversations so that you won't have a rocky listing with all this stuff coming up. Agreement to sell, 19. A lot of people jump over this one too. When a buyer is found for the said property, the owner shall enter into a written agreement sale, which will contain the terms, the condition, the sale of the property, the customary provisions as to the examination of title, the curing of any defects in the title, the proration of taxes, the rents, the applicable property expenses. So again, agreement to sell, they don't have to sell the property. But if we're listed at 350 and we bring you 350 offers, maybe even 347 offers, and you do not want to sell, then that's the conversation between you and the seller, that maybe they are not in this and we've bought you a ready, willing buyer. So we maybe do a commission even though you choose not to sell. That's another class entirely. But you want to make sure these sellers really want to sell. They are moving to a different phase of their life, and we're not doing listings, paperwork, photography, and all of this, and then they change their mind and not want to sell. It's a hard market. This definitely is a time to talk about where you're going before, because we know people who sell often have a hard time finding something. So do they have somebody they can move in with? Are they going to rent? Have they secured a rental? Apartments. I've got a client right now that can't get an apartment until June. So these, again, are conversations that will come up that will help you set yourself up and your seller for success. Lead-based paint, everybody knows, if you got your license already, 1978. So in addition to the property disclosures, if the home is before 1978, you're going to need another lead-based paint addendum. And you'll talk about that. Mediation clause. And here's on number 21. It just says, any dispute or claiming arising out of relating of this agreement, the breach of this agreement, or services in relation to this agreement shall be submitted in mediation in accordance with rules, procedures, and the dispute resolution system of the National Realtors. You know, the best way to explain this is if you've got a problem with me or the other agent or the other buyer, rather than 4 people going and hiring 4 attorneys and making 4 attorneys rich, we're going to kind of go to a mediation process that is not hired, but administrated by a National Real Estate Commission. And we're going to see if we can work it out in mediation versus just going straight to the legal system. Hopefully we don't get to that point. Fair housing, again, we'll talk about, we cannot determine who is going to be the buyer. You know, you can't ask me, where do they work? You can't ask me, where do they live? You can't ask me what color's their skin or what language do they speak. Realistically, the lender has processed them in terms of their job availability, their income. So those items could become steering. That's why you hear a lot of recent conversations now about the love letters and the pictures of buyers sitting on the front porch, which a lot of people used to think that was a good thing. But realistically, as long as they're pre-approved through a reputable lender, as long as the terms are fair to the seller, that is all we're looking for in a offer. Fax mail, a lot of things are going to be DocuSign, so you want to make sure that they understand that's a way of doing business in today's world. Enforcement, the parties agree that the broker may take action to enforce this agreement or collect any associated costs, fees, or damages. Owner agrees to reimburse or pay all brokers' costs in enforcing this agreement or collecting costs, fees, damages, including expense of attorney fees. Again, a different class, but you want to make sure they know if they are in breach of a listing agreement, what are the ramifications? If you go under contract, you want to make sure, because they can't find a house to buy, if they, you know, basically got out of that contract, that they could be up to pay both agents, both firms. They could be paying the buyer all their inspection costs. They could be paying the buyer's moving costs. If they've already put down a deposit, they could be paying the attorney for title work. They could be paying an appraisal. So you think this stuff never comes up, but realistically, you want to make sure what they're signing up for. And you want to briefly mention it. You don't want to spend all day and scare them out of listing, but at the same point, you want to make sure that this is how we feed our families. This is our profession. It is a serious listing agreement, and a seller is just not throwing his house on the market to see what he can get and then decide not to sell. So sex offenders 25, you know, we've learned in class, we don't touch that one. We're not police, we're not attorneys. So if anybody would ask about any sex offenders, the seller agrees that the broker is not responsible for obtaining or disclosing information in the South Carolina Sex Offender Registration, and no course of action should be brought against the broker in failure to obtain, disclose sexual offenders or criminal information. Seller sees that they have sole responsibility to obtain their sex offender, you know, and sellers and buyers are stalkers these days. We know they go online. We know if it's a multiple offer and we send them 3 offers and then we get 3 more, they probably already researched those people. So again, we don't get caught in those conversations, but we do disclose this to them. I am on page 5. Actually, in photography, you're going to tell them a million times their house will be for sale. Their house will be on the internet. There will be pictures on the internet. They'll know what your couch looks like. They will know what your kitchen looks like. You know, it's a beauty contest and a pricing war. We don't want to put out pictures that don't draw people to the listing, but you are essentially getting their permission to have photography up, so that if that picture gets picked up by a third-party site, we're not control of it. We are just control of what we put out there on the MLS. And I'll remind a lot of younger, newer agents, I say younger, but newer is probably the better word. Make sure they approve the listing before you send it out. You know, you want to make sure the words you use are the words that they agree with. You want to make sure if you're using an assistant, that your assistant hadn't put in 3-bedroom when it's a 4-bedroom. You want to make sure if it's a septic well, send them a copy of that MLS listing, send them the pictures, make them send you an email that they agree to the listing. Because the worst thing to happen is you or an assistant or whoever's helping you put in misinformation, not correct information, accurate, misaccurate. And then the seller is mad at you because it's not accurate. So I tell my sellers, look, I'm one person. You've been living here a lot longer than I have. Please make sure you go through this listing on the MLS sheet with a fine-tooth comb. I will not put it active until I have your permission, so that at least if something is wrong, that y'all both 100% made the attempt that everything was right. Surveillance 27, technology and surveillance has come so far since I got my license. You know, seller agrees to abide by any laws, regulations relating audio and video surveillance of the property and persons entering the property, including agreeing not to use any surveillance in areas where persons have an expectation of privacy, such as restroom. Seller agrees that the broker may or may not disclose potential surveillance as broker deems necessary, including signage on the property. So I always put may not. Some people may tell you different in some of the technology classes. It is still my understanding that in the state of North and South Carolina, you can video, but you cannot audio. We know seller's audio, but our job is to tell them you can video, but you cannot audio. I mean, yeah, but you cannot audio. I have a situation right now where I have a seller. A home inspector stood on his bed. We think home inspector would always have a ladder. It was pretty innocent. You know, I think he was just trying to read like the temp in the vent and didn't want to go downstairs to get the ladder. But the seller has video of where he stood on the bed. He actually damaged the bed. So it's a mess. So realistically, it is your job to tell every seller, I know you have cameras. First, do your cameras stay? Are they a part of the house or not? You are allowed to video, but you're not allowed to audio. Whether they choose to audio or not, we can't get in the middle of that, but by law, we have to tell them that. I mean, I have sellers all the time tell me, so-and-so got mud on my carpet. They didn't use the shoe boots that you provided. Well, how do you know? Because I saw them. So remind, if you have a buyer or a seller, let's just remind them, let's make sure that we are respecting people's homes. You know, there's all kind of horror stories in CE classes that you go to about surveillance. I don't want any part of it. Realistically, all I want to do is give the seller their guidelines, and I want to say that I may not disclose any potential because I don't want to be in the middle of it in terms of between a buyer or seller if they've been videoed or audio doing something they should not. Any questions about that one? That's kind of a hot bucket right now. The next part just says that we have been over this listing agreement. You understand it is a contract. It is a binding agreement. They have been explained this. Do they have any additional questions? This is between the broker firm Keller Williams and the seller. I am a reflection of Keller Williams. I am the agreement, but I don't own the listing. If something would happen to me tomorrow, somebody at Keller Williams would service them to the high level because it is an agreement between Keller Williams and the seller. Have them sign it, initial in the right places, and you are done. I put a lot into that because sometimes I told stories along the way, but in my experience, if you are a North Carolina agent, this South Carolina agreement is faster and easier than a North Carolina one. We've all heard that South Carolina buyer contract will change. As a broker, I was on a video about 2 weeks ago. I'm told the listing agreement will not change. It is just the contract of a South Carolina buyer contract will change. Any questions about anything? There are additional Keller Williams forms that you would need, you know, our septic, sewer, water form in a listing. But for the state of South Carolina, for compliance, you want to look and see what you need. But realistically, the form that I started with, Form 240, is really a great opportunity to help you prep for the listing, help you have a conversation with the seller before you get there, to ask him, you know, ask them, do you have a copy of a survey? You don't want them spending 20 minutes looking for a survey while you're there. Ask them to make a separate key before you get there, so you don't have to come back. If you're doing a listing, take your sign and lockbox. You may not be ready to put it up that day. If you build a good relationship with that seller, you can actually put that sign in their garage and ask them to put it out the day you go live. You could pop that key in that lockbox and say, set this out, or put it on the door. Make sure you're working smart and not hard, because you don't want to have to go back when they get a key, then go back when it's time for MLS. So we like to work smart and hard. Get all your documents while you're there. If it takes you another 10 minutes to have them fill out the property disclosure, let them fill it out when you're with them. You can answer any questions, but I can promise you, if you leave those property disclosures there, then you're going to be tracking them down to get them before you can list the house and have them in MLS like every great listing agent should. Questions, comments, anything? I see we got some experienced people on, so do they want to add anything to that? Well, we have a lot of more time in this time blocking, so I'm here for any other questions, whether it's North Carolina or South Carolina. If not, I put my email in the chat, and you can actually email me if you want a copy of the forms, just so you don't have to look them up, or if you want me to send you all the form numbers. If you have anything in addition to what we've discussed, I'll be glad to help you. And it doesn't matter if it's South Carolina or North Carolina. Anything? All right, that's all I got, unless we got questions. I appreciate y'all jumping in. Sorry we got a little late start. I jumped into this class yesterday and I didn't set up on Zoom, I think, the way I had to. So I had to use Liz to help me get in. So we logged on about 1 or 2 minutes late. So I apologize. But I thank you. And hopefully you'll review those forms. You'll go through them backwards and frontwards. You'll role play them with people, so that when you go to take a South Carolina listing, you'll be well equipped with what you need and how to service your seller at the highest level. Sounds good. That's all I got. Anybody have any questions before we jump off? All right, I'm out of here. Thanks so much.